Hi, my name is Phil Cass. I'm the API Centre Manager, and welcome to the API Centre webinar. Hope you're enjoying Techweek so far. We're pleased to have over 300 registrations for this event. So today we're going to be hearing from Gavin Wong, our lead architect at the API Centre, and also Jamie Leach, the Regional Director for F-Data in Australia and New Zealand. You're going to have the opportunity to ask our speakers questions through the Q&A function at the end of their presentations. And we're also going to be recording this session, so it'll be available online. We'll let you know when that is available. At the end of the session, there's going to be a short anonymous survey, so it'd be great to get your feedback, so please fill that out if you can. But before we get to our speakers, I'm just going to take you on a really quick whistle-stop tour of the API Centre. So, we launched in May 2019, but we had to do a lot of stuff to get there first. So the journey started with a pilot. So the pilot involved our largest banks, as well as Worldline, Datacom and TradeMe, to bring a third-party perspective. They spent 18 months attending working groups, which got us to our first version of the API standards, which was delivered in February 2019. So that gave us account information and payments initiation. We also designed our open banking framework. A key part of this was our governance. So Payments New Zealand board is ultimately responsible for the API Centre. However, they delegated responsibility to the API Council. The API Council is made up of 6 third parties, 6 API providers and 3 independents. So the council is responsible for recommending budgets, recommending work plans, overseeing the release of new standards and just general good governance. And that took us through to May 2019 with the launch, where Minister Chris Barfoy spoke and encouraged the API Centre to drive forward the open banking along with the industry. So who was involved in pushing forward with the API Centre? We have API providers, so our banks, financial institutions, so they're our data providers. Also third parties, those who want to use the data and payments initiation services. We also have community contributors. So that's a free membership, allows you to use our sandbox, which is powered by Middleware New Zealand, and also gives an opportunity to have input into our standards development pipeline and also our release candidates, and also receive up-to-date information on the goings on in the API Centre. So with our membership, we have 8 API providers, and including all of our largest banks and 13 third parties and 138 community contributors. I would love to see more membership. So if you're really interested and excited about what we're talking about today, I'll tell you at the end of this presentation how you can get involved. So from launch, we didn't stop. The industry worked together to continue with our standards development. Version 2.0, version 2.1 have been published. We've also got version 2.2 and 2.3, which is due for delivery July, August this year. And we're also working on the detailed scoping of version 3. Gavin will tell you more about that later on in his update. But the API Centre is so much more than just standards. We deliver customer experience guidelines, but these are detailed guidelines for consistent customer experiences across the industry. We have working groups. We have a business working group and technical working groups. They meet weekly on alternative Fridays, and that brings industry experts from our API providers and our third parties together to drive open banking forward in New Zealand. We have our industry sandbox, which is world-class, again, powered by Middleware New Zealand. We have our API Centre register. So that is the backbone of any open banking ecosystem. It enables trusted automated sharing of data, things like certificates, server locations. We've also got security profile, standards development pipeline, industry roadmap. We also have our operational rules and procedures, terms and conditions. So they govern the behaviours in the ecosystem. We also have partnering, which is a huge piece of work for us at the moment. So at the moment, we're creating a due diligence assessment criteria. So the purpose of this is to provide 80% of the due diligence questions that an API provider would ask a third party, and that would be consistent across the industry. And then the final 20% of a bilateral agreement will be worked out individually with each API provider. We're also updating our bilateral template agreement so that it gives you all the clauses that you would expect to see in a bilateral agreement. And coming down the road is the New Zealand customer data right. Payments New Zealand and the API Centre are a big supporter of the consumer data right. We've been sharing all of the work that we've been doing to date with the regulators, and we're hoping that CDR will build on all of this great work that we've done so far. So have a look around our website. There's a lot of information there. We encourage you to go and look at a website. We have an opportunity, if you have questions or you'd like to have a chat with somebody from the API Centre, send us a message through an expression of interest online, and somebody will get in touch with you. Also, you can, on our website, you can become a community contributor, which is really quick and easy and free. So visit our website, apicentre.paymentnewzealand.co.nz, and look forward to hearing from you and seeing a whole lot more third parties, community contributors. So now you've probably heard enough from me. So we'll now move to our first speaker, Gavin Wong. So Gavin was the Deputy Chair of Open Banking UK Design Authority. And then we're very lucky to nab Gavin in New Zealand to become our API Centre lead architect. Gavin's going to take us through the API standards and functionality from a technical perspective. So Gavin, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. I'm just going to share my screen. Hello, my name is Gavin Wong, and I've been working, as Phil said, as a technical architect with API Centre and coordinating the design of the API standards for the banking industry in New Zealand. I've also worked as the lead architect on the open banking program in the UK with the open banking implementation entity. What I'd like to talk to you about today is what API standards are and why we have them. API standards in this context govern the interactions between three players in an API ecosystem, which we can see here. They are the customer, the bank, which we refer to as the API provider, and the third party who wants to access the customer's data or functionality that's held with the API provider. You don't need standards to make these flows work, and there are many ways for API providers to work with third parties to have them access this information. And these details can be worked out bilaterally in a technical way. However, having standards has several side benefits, and they are that it simplifies the integration between third parties and API providers. So a third party knows that once they integrate with one API provider, they can integrate with all the other API providers in the exact same way. Customer expectations and functionality across the ecosystem can be managed. And so a customer is clearer about what information can be shared with the third party. Both of these things mean that there's further ease in adoption. It's easier for third parties to integrate, and for the comfort there is with customers sharing this data, both these things will lead to more adoption. It also provides us with a platform to learn and iterate. So as third parties evolve their offerings, requests can be made across the banks to implement the desired functionality in lockstep. And then you have an iteration, kind of a spiral upwards effect. But how do we develop standards? Well, within the open banking, globally, there are two common components of an API standard. The first is the security profile, and that defines the how on the interactions between the three parties, the customer, the third party, and the banks, how a third party lodges a request with the bank, how the customer approves that request with the bank, and how the bank accesses allows access to protected resources with a third party. And as part of these flows within the security profile, there are a few things we need to have to ensure that a customer's data is accessed securely. So they're the things that I've listed there. We want clear identification of all of the parties involved, secure and non-reputable communication channels, the prevention of unintended or unauthorized access of data, and all of this performed through a process where the customer's consent can be obtained, verified, and revoked. We also want this to be technically implemented using standard internet technologies to, again, ease adoption. And thankfully, there's a number of smarter people that have been looking at this internet-wide standards around this, and a number of other open banking ecosystems have landed on the FAPI security profile as a way of achieving these goals. And the FAPI security profile has also been used by OBIE in the UK and the CDR in Australia as well, and has wide technology support with vendors for off-the-shelf products that can be plugged into banks and third parties. New Zealand have also adopted the FAPI security profile as part of our overall API standard, and we've adopted FAPI version 1 advanced, and are keeping an eye on how FAPI version 2 evolves and the adoption with third parties. With vendors and other open banking ecosystems. So the security profile governs the how of the API standard. However, it doesn't cover what data can be shared once a customer gives a third party its consent, and the actions that the third party may take on a customer's behalf. And that's defined in the functional part of the API standard. So it's the what. Early on in the API center journey, as Phil mentioned, we looked at other open banking ecosystems globally, and decided that the UK OBIE standard was largely fit for purpose. We adopted the standard as a starting point, and have then taken a market-led approach to defining enhancements to the standard. One such enhancement has been the Enduring Payment Consent Standard, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. And as we aren't bound by regulation in New Zealand, we've also been able to agree and mandate that other elements of the standard be implemented by banks as mandatory adoption components, such as the customer party endpoint, or the information about the customer, and the statements endpoint as well. These have been deemed useful to have as mandatorily implemented by the banks in New Zealand. The EU, in contrast with the PSD2 regulation, have taken a regulatory approach. So banks are only obligated to implement what functionality they have in their online banking portals. And so regulators haven't been able to mandate functionality over the top of that. I also want to talk a little bit more about the development process, which Phil has also touched on. What we have in New Zealand is fortnightly working groups, both business and technical. The API Centre coordinates fortnightly technical sessions with industry, and these focus on the technical standards itself and the changes we need to make. We also have fortnightly business sessions that focus on the scope of the standards. So we have the business defining the scope, and then the technical working group executes on that scoping and defines the technical side of things. We've established a list of principles early on, like alignment with other international standards like the Open Banking Implementation Entity Standard in the UK. And subsequently, once we've established those principles, we work through the standards, and for contentious issues, we have a formal decision-making process where we write up what the issue is, discuss it as an industry, discuss options, and vote on the approach to take. And then that gets incorporated as part of the standard. We also have ongoing issues registers where people in the industry can identify issues that they have found with the standard, and that gets discussed at the fortnightly technical working groups as well. If required, the technical group identifies scoping issues back up to the business group to make decisions. So the principle here is very much to develop the standards as openly as possible within the ecosystem, and that's been working quite well today. So what we have here is the development pipeline. And as Phil mentioned, in February 2019, version 1 of the payment initiation standard and account information standard was published, and that was largely based on the version 1 of the UK OBIE API standard, so solid baseline standard. And we also then in 2020 issued the version 2 of the standard, which was largely based on the version 3 standard of OBIE, with the additional market-led functionality that was deemed necessary. And it's a major upgrade for version 2, some overall improvement, enhancements to the security profile. We also mandated, we put in the CBA specification into the push notification authorization decoupled flow request, and introduced enduring payment consent as part of that version 2. And version 2.1 and 2.2 have been extensions of version 2 with bug fixes and enhancements, but mostly mandating that certain elements of the version 2 standard were implemented by the bank. So making the decoupled flow mandatory, and also extending the list of the mandatory endpoints for account information as well. Version 3 is currently being scoped, and there are a few candidates for what we would like to include in version 3 going forward. And so that's being actively worked on this year and into Q1 next year. The candidates are being able to have a multi-authorization flow for the consent, being able to push notifications when there are updates to endpoints, and scoping out the possibility of a refund flow and what that would look like. Just for completeness, I wanted to also share the high-level flows. And the first is the account information data sharing flow. And this is how we ensure that a customer's consent is central to the data flows. So the first step is where a third party and a customer will agree the scope of the data sharing. The third party will send the scope of that data sharing, which is the consent, to the bank, where the bank then works with the customer to authorize that request. And the bank then exchanges an access token that's scoped to that consent. And so the third party will then be able to access that account information via the API standards the functional component of the API standards that we've agreed. And that will be scoped to the consent that's been agreed with third party. Similarly, for payment initiation, we have a very similar flow where the third party and the customer will agree the scope of the payment initiation, the payment amount, what account the payment will go to. The third party stages that request the bank, and the third party redirects the customer to the bank to authorize that request. And so with that, we can then scope that consent and exchange a token with the third party. The bank can exchange a token with the third party that's scoped to that request. And the third party then uses that token to initiate that payment. And as some optional flows for the third party to also then check on the status of that payment. And then just to cover off some of the market-led functionality that we've developed here in New Zealand, we've known from the start that authorizing every payment that needs to be made leads to a customer journey full of friction, and it's a very difficult third-party proposition, and can be useful in many contexts, but we've also wanted to extend that out. So being market-led in New Zealand has meant that we can develop a payment instrument where a customer and third party can agree what parameters a third party doesn't need to request an authorization from the bank. And so this could be agreeing a total amount that a third party can take out from a customer's account within a month, or the frequency of payments that a third party can make on behalf of the customer, or a cumulative amount of payments out of a customer's account. So a third party can agree what that consent looks like with the customer, stage that consent with the bank as an enduring payment consent type, and have the customer authorize that consent with the bank, and then the bank can exchange a token with the third party that scoped that enduring payment consent. Third party can then use that access token to initiate individual payments with the bank that are scoped to that overall consent and within the boundaries of that consent. And so that concludes my presentation, and over back to you, Phil.
Thanks, Gavin. Sorry, just some technical issues there, getting back on screen. But got a couple of questions here for you, Gavin. Can you advise what the acronym FAPI stands for and who manages it?
It stands for Financial Grade API, and it's managed by the OpenID Foundation. And so there are a number of layers of, I guess, if you will, security profiles that are issued by this working group. And I guess the base internet standard for this type of interaction where a customer delegates authority to a third party is called OAuth, or OAuth 2 is the version that underpins a lot of that redirect delegated authority access flow within the internet, I guess, via APIs. And so you have OAuth 2, and then as a layer on top of that, you have what's called OpenID Connect, which is OAuth 2, but with certain restrictions to ensure better security. And then the OpenID Foundation has also then issued what's called the Financial Grade API standard, which has an even more restrictive, in some cases, set of flows to ensure even greater security.
Okay, great, Gavin. Got another question here about the bilateral readiness of our API providers, which is a great question, actually. And that's exactly what our partnering due diligence assessment criteria is trying to do. We have tried to go as far as an accreditation regime, but we couldn't go as far as we wanted to around that because of the Commerce Act, which we didn't want to contravene. But we're absolutely working towards open banking bilateral agreements being easier to obtain. It's all very new in New Zealand, and so we're working to standardise that. Also got another question here, Gavin. Tell us about are batch payments supported and approval from a second person in a business environment? Is there anything coming on that?
Yeah, and there are two different things or bits of functionality. So in terms of batch payments aren't supported by the New Zealand standard at the moment, and they aren't currently part of the scope of version 3. So there's not been sufficient demand from the third parties in the industry to have that come into scope, but that may change. In terms of having multiple approvals for a payment that is in scope for the version 3 part of the standard. So being able to have multiple authorizers on both an individual payment via the API standard, as well as having multiple authorizers on an enduring payment consent. So for business accounts that require multiple authorizations, that should be in scope for version 3.
You've got a few questions coming through here now, Gavin. So you're talking about payments initiation functionality and potentially get there before Australia. Has there been any consideration around keeping the process consistent with Australia? And have you been speaking to those in Australia?
We've certainly been keeping abreast of the developments in Australia. Haven't caught up with the chief architect and CDR for some time, but I did used to have regular meetings. But I think in terms of the payment scope for CDR, I'm not sure quite where that's at, but we have been keeping abreast of the developments in Australia. I think, Phil, maybe, I don't know whether you want to talk to just generally the wider CDR, alignment activities.
Certainly New Zealand looking at Australian CDR and absolutely looking to take the best bits, I believe, from Australia and learn the lessons from Australia around CDR. So there's definitely a correlation around consumer data rights in Australia and what we can learn from them here in New Zealand. And just one final question for you, Gavin, is when do you expect to include a request to pay standard? Is that something that's on the horizon that's been spoken about?
Request to pay has been discussed by the industry, although at the moment it's, again, not as part of the scope that we've been discussing for the version 3 of the standard. It has been thought about, though, so it may come into scope at some point in the future, but isn't as part of the current known scope.
Great. Hey, thanks very much, Gavin. Nice work. Really appreciate your time. Really informative presentation, judging from those questions. A lot of interest. So if you've got any other questions, head to our website, have a look around, send us a message if you've got any questions. Thanks very much, Gavin, and speak to you soon.
Great, thank you.
So now I'd like to introduce Jamie Leach. So Jamie's beaming in from Brisbane, so it's an early morning over there, so I really appreciate your early start, Jamie. So Jamie is the Regional Director of FData in Australia and New Zealand, as I said earlier. He advises to the United Nations Capital Development Fund, is an expert in digital ID, digital finance, and works tirelessly on financial inclusion across developing nations. Jamie's highly respected, which is reflected through the ministers and regulators on both sides of Tasman who listen to Jamie and seek her guidance. So Jamie's going to speak on the power of open banking and on what the future might look like. So Jamie, over to you. Thanks very much.
So look, today I'm going to talk about the power of open banking and what it may mean for society going forward. Certainly in Australia, we are yet to really see the consumer uptake. In the UK, it took 3 years to get to 3% of the population using open banking at least once. So if we take that into consideration in Australia, we're only a couple of years in. We're less than 1 year in if you think of the actual deadlines and where the majority of the banks, the ADIs, had to comply with the sharing of data. We're yet to bring in really, really cool things such as payment initiation or action initiation. So we're just starting. And largely at this stage, we can just surmise what open banking may mean for society. There's many different definitions of open data and open banking around the world. Basically, open data is data that can be made public that is machine readable and human understandable in a nutshell. And when we talk about open banking, we generally look at definitions such as this, and they all mention providers or banks, data and APIs. Some of them will go as far as to talk about consumers, as this one does. But unlike Australia, very few mention consent. And that's one of the biggest differences between Australia and the rest of the world. Not to suggest that consent isn't one of the key moving parts of open banking or open finance. But Australia seems to have gone above and beyond trying to make the consumer's control of data and choice at the centre point of its rationale for adopting such a regime. So here's a bit of a map. I can't say it's up to date in the last couple of weeks, but whilst all the eyes are continuing to watch the UK and Europe, many more jurisdictions are quietly pursuing their own versions of open banking, open finance. There's countries on here that I was not even aware of that were either launching or close to launching open banking, open finance. You can see those around the world that are regulatory approach to open banking. You can see those that are regulatory PSD2 approach to open banking, much like parts of Europe and the UK. And then you've got the market-driven approach to open banking. Now, before I get yelled at by New Zealand being market-driven, which it very, very much was for the longest time, this map is obviously current enough to at least got the press release saying that the government is going to introduce a version of CDR. And as I say to Phil and the team at the API Centre and Payments New Zealand regularly, I'm hoping that New Zealand is going to be the first country in the world to truly get it right first time. So no pressure. But what does Australia's open banking or the consumer data right? Well, in a nutshell, it comes down to 4 core principles: customer, choice, connectivity, and confidence. So the consumer data right should be consumer-focused, customer-focused, as it's now being changed to. It should be for the customer, be about the customer, and be seen from a customer's perspective. It's questionable whether that's the way it's ended up. It certainly was designed to start that way, but somewhere along the lines, it has felt like it's become more about the data holders and those sharing the data than it's been about the customer's perspective. The consumer data right should encourage competition. It should seek to increase competition for products and services available to consumers or customers so that the customer can make a better choice. Once again, it was designed to create a level playing field for market entrants and for existing businesses that want to pivot to be more data-driven. But what we've seen is in the making of the CDR, there have actually been existing commercial businesses that have had to fold. And some of this has got to do with the drawn-out process of launching CDR. Some has got to do with new businesses, multinationals coming in, and some smaller local businesses not being able to compete. We've also seen a small number of banks being forced to merge or to be acquired because they literally cannot comply with all of the demands on banks at the moment. And CDR is just one of those. So then we have the consumer data right should create opportunities. It should provide a framework for which new ideas and businesses can emerge and grow, establishing a vibrant and creative data sector that supports better services enhanced by personalised data. That's the connectivity part. But the consumer data right should also be efficient and fair. It should be implemented with security and privacy in mind so that it's sustainable without being more complex or costly than is needed. And it's hoping by introducing normalisation and standardisation and security, as Gavin just mentioned, in FAPI standards, for instance, that confidence by participants as well as customers should grow from that point. So in a nutshell, my diagram, nowhere near as technical as the ones that Gavin just called up, but as we are dealing with read access only, so data sharing at this stage, in essence, consumer is where it all starts. They use an application or a platform, maybe it's referred by a friend, or maybe it's provided by their existing supplier, such as a bank. In using the application, they make a request for the data to be shared. They consent. That consent initiates the transfer via standardized APIs to the accredited data holder, who then releases that requested data back. So in very simple forms, that is the open banking that Australia is looking at. But do the consumers really care? Do they even care about how it works? In a recent post that I put on LinkedIn, I raised this very question, likening it to brain surgeons trying to explain their operating processes at the neighbourhood barbecue. I guess our neighbours don't care about how surgery works or even what surgeries are available until it is something that they actually need themselves or a family or a close friend. So when we talk about the real use cases, that seems to resonate better with the general public or those neighbours at that barbecue to explain the process itself. And in the immortal words of one of my members, Mac Walker from Cuscal, I share my data to get that thing that I want. And that's really the experience that we're seeing in Australia. When you are stuck in the trenches, you get so excited about every part of open banking and the consumer data right. But if you're a member of the public, you probably don't care less. And that's the sad truth right now. So all that consumers care about is the application that they've downloaded, that's been recommended, that they're using, works in the way that they expect, and that they will receive the benefits as expected and as promised. They want convenience. They want a service to instantly fill their request, instant gratification. They want to save time and money, and they want to feel in control of their lives. So they're not asking much, they just want everything. Consumers want to know what they're spending their money on. They want to use categorization tools. They want to compare products or services and how they stack up against their financial tools and services. They want to save for that special thing or their retirement or their child's education fund. They want to help make their money go further when the cost of living is rising as quickly as it is. Generations Ys and Zs, and not to say Gen Xs and all the rest of it, but Gen Y and Z are particularly interested in sustainability, carbon neutrality, making informed choices based on environment. SMEs and tradies, for instance, want to simplify their expenses and receivables. They want to use invoicing and expense reconciliation to try to make their life less about paperwork and admin. The concept of the bookkeeper in the box was born in the UK, and it continues to grow and appeal. There are platforms where businesses can literally get their point of sale data, HR, tax information, current transactions, any lending facilities, all of that in real time on a laptop or an iPad. Can you imagine standing in a retail store environment for that matter and literally having your fingertips of, on top of real-time data and being able to make staffing choices or stock purchases basically when it needs to be made? Savvy investors also want to move their investments around and they want to watch their pennies grow. So this is a diagram of, So consumers can now share the data that they have with the businesses they select for the use as they choose. The first stage of the CDR, open banking, is already helping Australians, but the journey has just begun. So Scott Farrell, the person that I blame for the consumer data right tongue-in-cheek in Australia, that's one of his famous quotes. It is happening, but it is not, as I said, it doesn't feel like it's coming from the consumer's perspective. And maybe that is just going to take time. I get asked constantly, are we there yet? And up until recently, I was being optimistic by saying we were about 2 miles into the marathon. I've upgraded that now. I think we're about 4 miles into the marathon, but that marathon is the entire consumer data right, not just open banking. So this is a diagram I started to talk about before. So it all starts with tracking the movement of money. We've heard the stickiness of money, the movement of money, how people are receiving and spending money is one of the most important aspects of consumers' lives and businesses as well. So once payment initiation is introduced in Australia, we're expecting a significant shift in the financial world as we know it. Tech companies and third-party platforms are hotly tipped to overhaul e-commerce and payment instructioning. And they're seeing that in Europe and they're seeing that in the UK now. It is not the banks that are moving money on behalf of consumers as much as it is third-party providers and apps that are being instructed to move money whilst purchasing through e-commerce or other platforms. Open finance will then allow the consumer or the customer, be it retail or business, to make informed choices about their finances and to get that true 360-degree view of their assets in as close to real time as possible. This will also provide new competitor opportunities and a further blurring of the banking as a service lines, where we expect to see people classifying themselves as financial services in sectors that we have never even considered before. The next layer will include other sectors, and we're seeing that sort of juxtaposed position in Australia with energy and telco being launched this year and next year, respectively. But there's an infinite number of additional data points or sectors that could be added in Australia if we could solve for the privacy and standardisation issues that we experience. And finally, the pièce de résistance government data, such as licensing of driver's licenses, for instance, educational records, access to Medicare transactions through health. It's limitless. The ability to create tailored use cases that streamline processes from drawn-out inconvenience practices that we have now across multiple locations, touch points, and sadly enough paper to level a jungle, to a simple click of a screen or a device. This will be in line with finally getting around those, hoverboards that we were all promised. Thank you, Michael J. Fox. So once again, this is a graph very similar to one that Gavin held up before. How does open banking currently work? Consumer uses an accredited data recipient. Accredited data recipient sends a message to a data holder saying, I want the consumer's data. The data holder goes, I just want to check if the consumer actually did this and you're not just getting hold of data you shouldn't. They send an authentication and a verification message back and forth. Finally, the data flows once the consumer, usually logging into the bank's site separately, confirms that it is them and they do want to share whichever data they select. But now let's get to the cool stuff. This is what I think open banking and the consumer data right could mean for society going forward. This is Pete. Pete is married to Sue, and they have found their next dream home. Lovely home on the top right. I don't know where the house is, doesn't matter. So Pete toddles off, takes time off work, goes down to the branch and speaks to somebody at the counter saying, I'd like to apply for a mortgage. I want to see if we can afford it and what rate you're going to give me. The branch manager then informs Pete that the home lending manager is very busy and can't see him for about 2 to 3 weeks. But if he wants to get some paperwork in order before he comes back, here is the proverbial shopping list, and it is a mile long. So Pete, feeling a bit sad, goes home, says to Sue, we've got to get all of this stuff together, pay slips and balance sheets and budgets and superannuation balances, and the list goes on. We all know how this works. But what if the bank could use open banking and they've already got access to all of this stuff without Pete and Sue having to put the shopping list together? What if they could trawl through their version of customer data or have the data directly to collect from other banks on behalf of a customer? So they might have accounts with one of the big fours and another big four and then a regional, and open banking allows all that to come together. Then they can use categorization tools to start to go through what's the customer spending money on and how does that actually come in line with their own internal lending policies. They could look at source of credit scores immediately. They could use a personal finance management app to get a whole of customer viewpoint, confirm income against transactions recorded, see their superannuation balances. All of these services exist, yet the banks are not using them on a large scale yet. But what if it could go further, much further? What if once the bank does that and they see that Pete and Sue are actually eligible for a mortgage and they're a good mortgage potential customer, so they send a notification back through the app saying, yes, we would like to offer you a mortgage. These are the terms and conditions, the rates, everything else. And Pete and Sue look at it and go, oh, that's great. I'm going to tick the box to say, yes, I would like that mortgage. And while I'm at it, I'm going to tick another box to say, you can close my previous mortgage with another competitor bank, and I give you permission to port anything over and to open this mortgage on my behalf. Literally, ticking of screens can start to change consumers' time. And it's going to revolutionise the process internal of the bank as well, because I'm very much aware that the staff don't like the shopping lists and the staff would love to have something different to offer better services to their customers. But now let's have a look and say, what could we do in education, and what's open banking got to do with sending a child to school? Imagine if you had a son, little Johnny, we'll call him. And Johnny was fast approaching a significant milestone of either attending school for the first time or maybe he's due to go off to a high school. So you've been researching schools for months now, speaking to other mums and dads, and you think you've chosen the one. You open up the app for the school or you get onto the website for the school. You literally start to tick boxes. Yes, I would like to inquire about enrolling my son. Yes, I consent for my son's educational records to be shared. Yes, I consent for my bank account to be assessed for serviceability. And yes, I consent that I am a legal guardian and able to enrol my son in the school. Off it goes. The schools makes the current checks and balances. Is the educational record, are the grades up to par? Can you afford the school? Are you the type of people that they want at the school? And then they send an offer back. Yes, we would like to offer little Johnny a place at the start of next term. Please consent for your bank account to be debited on a quarterly basis for fees. Please consent that this is a credit card that we can charge for any incidentals, camps, excursions. And once again, please consent that you wish to accept this position. Done. It is literally 2 screens and 1 notification in the middle, and that whole process can be done, and it can be done through the consumer data right. But the last one I'll bring you, because I notice I'm close to time, can it extend further? Can we go from banking to finance to education to the road? Absolutely. Now think about it. You've found your dream car. You've been wanting to buy for years and years and years, but you're very busy. You might be busy working or busy with family. Imagine letting your fingers consent to comparing car models, prices, and then selecting the one you want through an app. Being able to immediately compare and arrange insurance and financing options. Being able to register your car without having to leave your couch or your office. Being able to check if your license is still current, to make any updates to licensing, all in the same app. Ticking several boxes will absolutely revolutionise your entire experience about receiving that car. This is a type of supercharging that will be possible once we start to see different sectoral data mingle and greater attention put on the consumer's experience at the end of the day. But who will be brave enough to break ranks and build these super use cases? We're living in a digital world with data being shared in real time via APIs right now. Open banking is just the start of consumers leveraging their data to create enhanced customer experiences. They don't need to know how it works. They just need to trust that it will. So look, thank you very much. That's my presentation from today. I'll stop sharing my screen and back to you, Phil.
Thanks, Jamie. Awesome presentation. It's always a pleasure listening to you, how open banking and CDR can unlock the future for us. Just go to a couple of questions. So, Jamie, with CDR on the horizon, what are some important things that New Zealand can learn from Australia at this early stage?
Look, I don't want to be incredibly critical of the Australian experience. It's easy to look back and say, oh, I would have done things differently. But there are a couple of key points. Firstly, Australia chose to separate read access and write access at the same time. And I think they did it for the simplification of trying to get the data flowing, which I can understand. But in doing that, they have in some way missed being able to introduce some of these much more complex use cases that may have been adopted by customers early on. So that ability to be online shopping, for instance, to have somebody verify that you can afford something, and while you're at it, they can just go ahead and make the purchase and make the payment all in one situation. That's what we're seeing through e-commerce and merchants, especially across Europe and the UK. There will be many other things. So look, I don't know if New Zealand should necessarily separate read and write access. I would think that it's possible to introduce them both at the same time. The other area that Australia has really, in some ways, not completed is the separation between businesses and retail customers. So initially there was meant to be a difference in the way data was treated between business data and individual data. That never quite finalised. So we're now left with unique situations where SMEs, for instance, that had access to certain invoicing or receivables or expense reconciliation apps that aren't going to be able to get access to them because these smaller players aren't able to be accredited at this point in time. So you literally forget about the consumer experience and say you can do something one day quite lawfully, but the next day we haven't made the provisions for you to be able to do the same thing. It just seems illogical in some ways that this has been handed down. And lastly, the third thing I'd say is Australia's regime has ended up being incredibly prescriptive in the absence of a robust privacy framework. And this is something I'm very passionate about. The UK, Europe, even Brazil have had the benefit of GDPRs, LDPRs, for instance. Canada's looking to adopt a GDPR. That will take up the lion's share of the privacy implications. So if somebody does break ranks and do the wrong thing with consumers' data, it's covered. We will then see contract law be strengthened in these jurisdictions. So if through a bilateral partnering agreement, for instance, one of the brands willfully do the wrong thing, there will be avenues for that to be obviously remedied as well. Australia, we didn't have any of that. So we have literally built everything out to the nth degree, trying to cover consumers' liability, consumer privacy, liability of the accredited participants. The list just goes on. So just in a snapshot, there's some of the biggest things I think New Zealand needs to watch for.
Okay. Thanks, Jay. We've got time for one more really quick question. Is there anything that New Zealand can learn from Australia for third-party accreditation?
Absolutely. I think I would have liked to have seen the accreditation model very much simplified. Literally, can you demonstrate the security? Are you a legal entity? Are you already operating within a financial services realm? I don't think we needed to introduce as many tiers as we have. And I know it got incredibly complex to try to remove the barriers to entry and some of the costs that became quite prohibitive. I would literally go as simple as saying you have data holders, data recipients. I don't think you need to muddy the water with, a whole litany of tiers and then external classifications. And maybe consider, once a bank has shared the data with a recipient, is that where it all ends? Has the instruction been conducted? Has it been carried out? Does it matter if the customer then wants that to be shared with their accountant or financial planner? These are the questions I think time should be spent on.
Great. Hey, thanks very much, Jamie. That's awesome. And I always feel like a smarter person after hearing you speak and talking to you. So thanks very much. And
thanks for having me, Phil.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Jamie. Well, thanks again to our two speakers, Gavin and Jamie, for joining us today. Really appreciate your time. And thank you to everybody today who's joined us online. I hope you found it really interesting. If you'd like to hear more of our insightful speakers, then be sure to get along to our Payments New Zealand conference. So that's to be held on the 9th and 10th of November. So registrations are going to be open shortly. So we'll be hearing about that in the next few weeks, 2022. So just remember that this was recorded, and so that'll be available soon online. We'll let you know when it's available. And please do our survey at the end. And thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Stay safe, and I'll look forward to speaking to you all soon.